Welcome everyone to the lecture by Matt Turner. He's a game design director at Electronic Arts, and let's go.
Thanks for the intro. I'm not sure how many people are here, but I was going to have some discussion at the end. We'll see how that pans out. So just jumping right into it, as you said there, my name is Matt Turner. I'm a game design director at Electronic Arts in Vancouver, and I'm currently working on the FIFA franchise and have been for the last few years. This talk's going to go far beyond that into some other more fundamental ideas in terms of game development and what character means to our medium as an entity inside of creativity. What I want to talk about is the relationship between characters as they are in stories and how that links to the idea of mechanics and gameplay and what those two concepts can do together to make each other better. So we'll just launch into it and start figuring stuff out. So first things first, this is my resume in short form, just where I come from. The only real takeaway from this is that I've been in the business for a while, and I've got a pretty broad cross section of experience from, as you can see, sports games to shooters to open worlds to stealth games and a few other pieces here and there. And over this time, I've been thinking about this concept and with working with my colleagues and my contemporaries and developing these ideas across these different genres and spaces and seeing these commonalities and these different concepts that can link them all together and the things that help us discover what games can truly be and what storytelling can become in the future. What I'm hoping for anyone to take away from this lecture or this talk would be to think differently about the relationship between character and gameplay, which are often thought about as two separate entities inside of a game experience, right? You have the gameplay, which is what you do as a player minute to minute, holding your controller with your mouse and your keyboard. And then you have the character, which is something that's usually told to you through cinematic or logs that you might pick up or text. But it's a more passive experience that you just absorb through playing through it versus experiencing it. That's how people perceive it, at least. And my position is that that's not the right way to look at it. That's wrong, and it's not what the strength of gameplay is. And we'll explore what I mean by that as we move through this presentation. Just to give you a little background on what I've done, I've had some successes and failures with these ideas. The first one is, this is what it looks like when you do it badly, I would say. This is a game that I was involved in called Battlefield Hardline. I'll give you a little clip here, where this is the main character breaking into a warehouse. I have to turn the sound off here, it's not important, with his partner to spite another police officer not giving him the glory. So they jump into this warehouse and start indiscriminately firing at strangers with machine guns. And do so very effectively. This is not something that police officers ever do. And so as a fantasy of being a cop, this sequence right here, which is part of the story, breaks it fundamentally and also breaks the character you're playing, who is a good-natured and honorable police officer. As you can see, like I'm saying, this action he's taking is far from those things. So I would say not my best work. Something that was more successful more recently, this is The Journey from FIFA 19. And this is just a little clip of the climax of the trilogy, which is the two of the protagonists. There's Alex Hunter, and coming in here late is Danny Williams, meeting in the Champions League final, and the player, having played with both of them for quite some time and understood their stakes, has to make a decision on which one of them they want to go and try and win the trophy with. Then they get to express themselves on the pitch after versus a person they spent a lot of time with. So this is a good marriage of mechanic and stakes between what the player wants and what the characters in the game want. And we felt pretty happy about how this landed with the fans and the experience that it delivered in the end. So those are just two quick examples of where I'm coming from with my experience, but I'm actually going to go beyond that into some better examples of other people's work that I think better represents the ideas that I'm going to talk about. So before we get into all that, where are we now in terms of game story and character is a broad question that I want to answer quite quickly. Essentially, it's going to take a little bit of a history lesson of a different medium to figure out this as an analogy. So I would say if you look back in time in the film industry, in the 30s, you see these films, Frankenstein in 32, Wizard of Oz in 38, and Snow White in 39. These, I call, and several other people call them the precursors to what would ultimately be the golden age of film. And the golden age of film was kicked off, most everyone agrees, by films like the Citizen Kane and Citizen Kane, sorry, and the Maltese Falcon. But these films laid the foundation and groundwork that led to the quantum leaps that those films took later on, a couple of years later, so in 42. And they started to discover what films could do that was different to what theater would do. And at that time, in the early 30s and the 20s and the aughts, theater was the apex of visual art. Right? If you wanted to perform something, you were on stage. If you were a real director or a real actor or a real writer, you were doing it for the theater. And you can see the influence of theater in early film, where a lot of these films were borrowing from the toolbox. They would often, really early on in the aughts, you'd see films that were just shot to one set, right? And they would cheat to camera. They would use a lot of very exaggerated theatrical movements. They'd answer the phone like this, hello. And they'd even project, right, in their voices, which is strange when you think about film now, that you would never do that. It's actually quite the opposite. But at that time, that was the gold standard. So they were taking all the same things that they took as gospel from theater and applying them to film. And it wasn't until these precursors, and then later on, what you would call the cornerstones of the golden age of film, discovered the tool sets that they actually started to make films unique. And those things are things like deep focus, which was something that was developed in Citizen Kane, which was actually an accident. Orson Welles just actually liked ceilings a lot. So he would always try and get ceilings into his shots, and that would require him to have it in focus as well. And so that gave rise to this idea of deep focus, but he wasn't trying to get two things in frame at the same time. He was just trying to get the ceiling in there, which is a funny little anecdote. But anyway, things like that, things like close-ups where you didn't have to use exposition or dialogue to have a character's inner thoughts come out, which, like you do in theater. You could just get in close and use an actor's face to express them. All these things came to pass and ended up just demonstrating what film was going to be in the future and kicked off this era. I think that right now, games are in that precursor phase where we haven't quite discovered and reached that critical mass in terms of the mass market understanding the medium, and I haven't had experiences yet that take all of the best parts of game storytelling that's unique to the medium and put it together in one experience that the world at large can understand clearly. Having said that, we have a lot of really great games out there, and these are just three of many. These also all happen to be open world games and such. That's just a coincidence. But these are games that do certain elements of what makes game storytelling really unique and strong, do it very, very well. And I think, my position is that in the future, we'll look back, and these will be our precursor games, that we can see the elements that feed those cornerstone games that will be coming in the future. When I talk about the toolbox of film borrowing from theater, right now games are doing the same of film and movies, right? So what I mean by that are certain concepts that are taken as granted, and we adopt them in our medium and use them in the same kind of ways. Things like dialogue, right? The very concept of two characters sitting on the screen talking to each other. Linear plots, right? Act structures, so the 3 and 5 act structures are standard for even literature, theatrical and film. We take those, even though they don't always fit very well in what we're doing. And at a more high level, the very idea of empathy as the central mechanism for connection to characters. When you're watching a movie or a TV show, you're empathizing with the characters on the screen, right? You're seeing them in their situation and going, oh, I would feel that bad too, or oh, that would make me feel mad, or oh, I would be very happy, and you're trying to connect with them on that level. Whereas in games, we have the power and the ability to make people actually experience those emotions versus empathizing. And we tend to lean into empathy in cutscenes in various places versus allowing players to actually feel those moments themselves via mechanics. So the central concept that strings us all together is this idea of ludonarrative harmony. I didn't coin this phrase. A former colleague and contemporary of mine, Clint Hawking, did at Ubisoft. He actually coined the term ludonarrative dissonance, which is the opposite, and I'll get into what that means in a second. But to give you an idea of where this came from, where just, you know, the etymology of the term, ludo is Latin for play, so that means action and mechanic. Narrative is a story, of course, so that's your character and your plot. And then harmony obviously is in sync. These things are working together. And like I was speaking about before, the idea that your action and your character are two disparate things is something that we want to dispel and focus on the idea of those two things being two halves of the same whole and working together in harmony. Some really good and recent examples of this. The Last of Us 2, the Last of Us series in general, is a fantastic series, and they do an exceptional job of keeping the player in harmony with the actions of Ellie. You feel her desperation. You take actions managing your resources and feel her always struggling to keep her what she has at her disposal in the best possible order. You feel her pain. You feel the fear that she has to deal with, and you feel with the challenges that are set in front of her that she's trying to overcome, you have to overcome them as well. And the entire mood and all the actions the player can take are directly in sync with what Ellie's trying to accomplish as a character. And it's a very, very harmonious, and it's an excellent experience. And I would definitely recommend playing it if you haven't. It's definitely best in breed, I would say, right now for that type of more linear story. But let's step back from that and get into something a bit more against the grain of what we're talking about. This guy here, he's the most ubiquitous video game character of all time. I think few would argue that. He's been around for 37 years, and he's had many incarnations in various Nintendo properties. And we all know it's Mario. And Mario is more of a cipher for most people. You don't actually think of him as really a character, right? When you think about who is Mario. Right? What does make Mario? What makes Mario's character? Usually, you think about him as jumping on mushrooms and going down pipes and running around. But he actually does have a character inside of him that's quite finely crafted. He's a plumber, which is funny because that actually was an accident. They didn't intend for him to be a plumber. That was just a byproduct of pixels they saw, and it looked like overalls, and they thought overalls were plumbers. Plumbers were overalls, so they made him a plumber. And then he's from Brooklyn. I'm not sure where that comes from either. I've done some research. I'm not sure why Brooklyn, but I guess they thought there was a lot of Italian plumbers in Brooklyn, which is kind of funny. Which again, the interesting part though, underneath that, which is his real character of being cocky, of being playful, reckless. He's kind, he's courageous. He has all these defining characteristics that allow you to experience him as a player. Which, if you look at those on their face, a lot of those exist in a player as they enter any game space. Getting deeper into the example, as we watch this clip here, I want you to take note of what the actions they're taking when they're doing this right now, what they're choosing to do and how they're executing this. So before you just get to this moon, it's an objective that you're doing for the entire experience in Mario Odyssey. By the way, also a fantastic game. If you haven't played it, you should. But here he goes to this next evolution in the mechanics, which is the first time he'll try this. And he's going to toss his hat on this animal's head and then jump off of a giant monolith over a purple roiling sea. It's an amazing mechanic, and Nintendo is known for their pedigree of making mechanics first and really fun experiences that are predicated on awesome action, and this is no different. But when you think about the characteristics that I just named and what it means to him as a character, in this moment, you lose Plumber in Brooklyn because those are those idiosyncrasies of history for him. But you also get the player being cocky, right? As a player, when I do that, when I look at the environment around me and I say, I can throw my hat at anything and take that thing's mind, you are being inherently cocky. You're also being playful. It's playful in its presentation. There's no pain behind it. There's no suffering in the creature who you're inhabiting consciousness. They just, gladly let you take over and do your thing, and then after that, they move on with their lives. It's exceedingly reckless, both from the player standpoint and action, where you're jumping off of this monolith with no idea of how well this thing can fly, if it's going to glide or if it's going to get tired. You don't know how well it's going to work, but you just do it anyway because it's fun. And at the same time, it's courageous. You're missing kindness in this action just simply because that's a broader thing that he does. He's a savior. He's always helping people out. Mario is. So he has that inside of him, and so the player is always doing those things as well. So you're seeing this really nice harmony between the character of Mario and what the player's actions there as they're moving through the game. The interesting part about Mario is that all of these and the other traits that he embodies have been born out of the mechanical evolution of the character, right? As the new iterations come out by every new generation and every new version of Mario, Mario is given different abilities, and those abilities shape his character over time. I would be surprised if the guys at Nintendo back in the 80s thought all of these things about Mario and then sought to build those mechanics to support it. This is the things that he became after they made all these games, but it's still no less a great example of harmony in gameplay and character. Another great example is this guy here, Arthur Morgan, in Red Dead Redemption 2. A lot of people look at Rockstar products and they think of chaos, right? I get to go into an open world and I get to do what I want when I want. I can raise hell. I can mess with the NPCs. I can do whatever I want, and that's what it's about. It's a joke, right? The whole thing is a bit facetious, and it's all about how much trouble you can make. That is true, and that's a very carefully selected set of player actions, but it's also very well crafted from a character standpoint, and I can get into what I mean by that. Arthur is an outlaw. Arthur is an avenger. He's a provider. He's a listener, which is interesting. He's also lonely. He's a frontiersman. He's a predator, and he's fearless. He's other things as well. These are all core tenets of his character that are all very carefully selected and crafted to line up with what the player is going to be doing in the Old West as they explore this territory. There's a quick clip I'm going to show you here. Arthur is hunting bison on the plains by himself. And so in this really simple and fun action the player can take, and they can do it whenever they want, right? They can deviate from the main path of the story and go and hunt and trap things at their leisure, among a myriad of other mechanics. In doing this, the player is embodying Arthur Morgan as an outlaw, as the character that he's been described as, and all the actions they take marry with that in that space. It's all very carefully crafted, because when you think about it, if you were making this fiction in the Old West, Arthur Morgan could be a prospector, he could be a farmer, he could be a tycoon coming to build railroads, he could be a police officer, he could be all those things. But if he was any of those things, we spoke about before, which is the player's desire to go in there and raise hell and have fun and mess with the systems in a open world environment, it would be in complete dissonance with the character, right? And the player. The player would be trying to do these things, and the character that they're trying to embody would not be able to do them. Whereas we're playing an outlaw as Arthur, you can do those things, and you're staying true to that character. It's a very particular choice, which seems obvious, but it actually leads to a lot of really interesting ideas. When you get it back to his character, he's an outlaw. So in the action that you take of going to hunt bison illegally, you are being an outlaw by doing that as a player. In this case, you're not being an avenger, but you are being a provider for your homestead. You're bringing back meat and furs and resources for them to grow and prosper. In this case, you're not being a listener, but that is an interesting one, because the player is a listener in general, right? You're in this environment and you're listening to the world around you and you're paying attention to it. And so Arthur is as well, right? He's a quiet guy by nature. He doesn't have a lot to say. And most of the time he's just sitting there letting the world around him kind of unfold. And that lines up with you as the player. He's also lonely in the single player experience. You are by definition alone. And they even go so far to make their protagonist lonely, right? So he's not constantly surrounded by people, and he's also trying to push out constantly by himself. That's his thing. He's happiest when he's on his horse in the frontier. Of course, you're being a frontiersman when you're hunting bison with a bow and arrow and then skinning them on your own, doing all that stuff. very, very adeptly. You're being a predator, and you can be a predator in other ways, right? When you execute missions with people and various other mechanics that are in the game. And of course, he's fearless, which is also an interesting and really important piece. Gamers aren't particularly fearless when they're playing a game. There aren't really real consequences to them, right? You die, and some games have heavier consequences than others. But for the most part, you start at your last save point, and you keep going, and you can try things, and there's no real cost to failure, and that you don't want that. So by that fact, you're not scared really of anything. And so if you had a player who was a character who was scared, that's going to again be in dissonance with what the player is feeling in that space. So they make Arthur very deliberately, very, very forcefully fearless. He can go in any situation, and he's unrattled and unfazed, and he'll do anything. And so all these character traits, again, they feel obvious when you play the game, but they're all very carefully selected. And I would say Rockstar is at the top of their game when they're making these environments and these characters, because they work in perfect harmony with what they're trying to accomplish as an experience. So now we've had a couple of good examples. We can look at one that isn't quite so strong. I would preface this by saying I think Gears of War is a fantastic franchise, and I play them all, and I love them. But this particular character isn't one of their strongest in terms of the harmony that she has with the world around her. This is Kate Diaz from Gears of War 5. She was in 4 as well, but in 5 she was one of the protagonists. You look at her, and she's a gear, of course. She's a renegade, she's willful, she's intellectual, she's emotional, she's patient, she's courageous. These are all the character traits that are in her when you watch the scenes that she's in, or when you go and start looking into the more detailed stuff of the lore online. You can find all this stuff. It's all out there for you to look for. But this is the character they try to bring to bear in the product, which is a great character in a vacuum, right? This is an interesting character you're going to explore. But when you go into the game and you actually look at what you're doing as a player, when you're playing Kate Diaz, it starts to get a little bit disjointed, right? So we look at here what she's doing. Right now the players are upgrading their stuff, which is great. You could argue this is her being intelligent, but this is something you can do in any character, in any player in Gears of War. But here she hops on this snowboardy, slutty, I don't know what that is, parasail thing, and starts making her way to the next checkpoint with her friend, her partner here. And it's a great set piece and a mechanic. It's fun, super satisfying to play, and I would say that's Gears of War's strength. It is just really fun to play. All the stuff that you do, all the actions you take are really satisfying. But in this case, when you're playing Kate Diaz, the things that you're doing here are at odds with the character that you're trying to play with, right? So if you look back at the things that I raised as your character traits, you're not being a renegade, right? Because you're being told what to do and you're doing it. You're not being particularly intellectual. You're just riding this thing through snow. You're not being emotional. You're not being patient. You're not even being particularly willful, right? Because again, you are following orders. You can't really be willful in a Gears game as much as you can in, say, an open world like Zelda or even Red Dead, where you can just, whenever you want to, go and do something you want to do on your own that has nothing to do with what the game needs to do to move forward in the story. That is a mechanic in and of itself that allows you to be willful. Like, I don't want to do that. I want to go up and I want to, collect herbs on the Hardline Plateau for 40 hours. You can do that, and that's you being willful. But in Gears, you have to move forward. There are corridors that are leading you to the next set piece and the next moment where you can shoot something, and that's what it's about. So Kate is a gear. She's a good gear. She gets guns and she does things well and she kills all the monsters in front of her, but she's not embodying, doesn't allow players to take actions that allow them to be the things that the cutscenes and the character is trying to be. So you wind up in this space where you're not in sync with your main character. You're feeling off with them. You're feeling that dissonance where I'm playing through it. It is satisfying and fun, but when I see the scenes, I'm like, but that's not who I am. I'm doing different things. And again, this is not to say the game is bad. Actually, the game's quite good. It's just it's a place where maybe it could have been elevated if they had thought about her character a bit differently. So now we get into what comes first, right? When we're making these experiences, how do we do it? Do you start by imagining a character and then building the mechanic to support that character, or the inverse of that, where you think of some actions and the mechanics that you think will be fun, and then you make a character to embody those different actions? The frustrating answer is that it depends on the situation that you're in and how you're trying to move forward. And I can get a bit more specific on that. I think the first question you have to ask yourself is, what are your immovables? What things are true of your development situation that you cannot change? and that you'll have to respect. That can be stuff like the size of your team, your engine, your mandate. If you're part of a bigger publisher or studio, and they want you to make a certain thing, you have to do that. If you're making a sequel or a trilogy, other existing mechanics that you must use because your company's invested in making those. All those pieces are going to inform what you might be able not to do, right? And being creative in these situations is just as much about what you can't do as much as what you can do. So define these, number one. Number two, then ask yourself, what experience do you want to provide? What do you think will be different about what you're going to make that you're going to be able to ask people to invest the amount of time that you're asking them to put into it, right? If you think about playing a game like the ones I've talked about, like, Red Dead Redemption is 60 hours plus if you get through just the story. I mean, it's many more than that when you go online and if you want to explore the world at large. Even a linear game like Gears, you're talking 20 hours minimum. And these are big investments of time, right? You are asking a human being to say, I'm going to spend 100 hours of my life in your world, and you better be sure that what you're doing in that world is going to be worthwhile to them, that your experience is something that is going to give them something they can't get elsewhere. So that's a good question for yourself to ask. What experience do I want to provide? And then we can take this into an example just to make it a bit more concrete. So if we're going to make a shooter like a Call of Duty or a Battlefield, that does close many doors for the kind of story that you can tell, right? And this is a really specific and movable. If I'm coming into a project of this scale, like a Call of Duty, for example, there are things that are just true, right? It's going to be a realistic war simulator. There's going to be a big multiplayer component. It's going to be first-person shooter, and it's going to be hyper-real. And so all those things immediately shape how I'm going to be able to tell my story and the kind of characters that I can bring to life in that story. And what I mean by that is you can't tell a love story down the barrel of a gun, right? The actions of shooting a gun, an M4 or whatever it might be, is not an affectionate or a nurturing action. You can't express love by shooting something in the face. But you can do other things. So what it does is that becomes not part of your subject matter, right? You have to discard that and focus on the things that do make sense, that you can pay off and explore with that action. So that's why you see these reoccurring themes in these war games of revenge and protection, tyranny, power, desperation, brotherhood, domination, control. These are all themes. They can be elements of character that are very common, and you'll see them constantly over and over and over again. That's not because the people making these games are not creative. It's because these are the things that are at their disposal in that environment. And so then it becomes about execution. How well can I do that and tweak it just a little bit so it feels different than the last one, or find some new fertile ground but inside these themes, but by doing it in a specific way. So it really becomes about the craft of understanding all these things and bringing them to light in the best possible way. I would also say that over time, right, you get a big body of work behind you that you can look at as reference, and it helps you develop these ideas more and more crystallized. And I also say that if you find yourself in this situation where you're creating story and character for a Call of Duty, you're doing very well for yourself, and it's really fun. You have a lot of resources and a lot of things that you can do that you otherwise can't do. And so those immovables that might seem limiting are free in other ways. And so once you accept them and move forward, you can make sure that your experience and your characters are going to live and be the best they can be inside this world. But what does it look like when I have a blank slate? What if I just have some resources and some people and some time to make a game? And this is something you see more often in an independent developer. Or sometimes, incubation teams at big publishers get a shot at something like this, where they just make something, right? You're talented, we want to see what you got. Going back to the question of what comes first, the chicken or the egg, the character or the mechanics, I would say that neither come first, actually. The first thing that comes in that situation is your engine, is your technology. What are you going to use to make this experience? Because that in and of itself will close some doors for you, right? Various engines are good at various things, and you're better to focus on the things that make them strong, and those will help inform the kind of story you can tell. So say it's for the case of this example, you're going to be using Unity because it's the free version. Maybe you have a license, it doesn't really matter. That gives you some ideas of what that engine's capable of and what you can do based on your team. And maybe it's still pretty small, and maybe your team's art heavy. Maybe you've got a lot of artists in your team who are very talented. So you want to try to make your experience tailored to your strengths. But also maybe you have an affinity for like the side scrollers of the past, right? The SNES ones like Flashback or anything like that, where you have a character moving left to right across screens solving puzzles. And that's something you want to bring back. You want to celebrate it a little bit. And so you want to have that. You want to have a character moving left to right across the screen, running, and then solving puzzles. And you ask yourself, what kind of character has to do that? Right? It has to always be moving. It has to always be looking for that way out or running across the screen. What if they were running from fear or death, or fear itself, or maybe they're running from the environment around them? And maybe you make a game like Inside, which is a game based in Unity, side-scrolling platformer where the child is always running, and you are running from the world around you, which is fear and is death. And it's an amazing example of the synchronization between the character in a game and the player. I'm always in the same state as the boy. I'm always trying to get away from this nasty monster. I'm always trying to get him to the next frame. And he's always trying to do the same thing and move forward. And without any words or any dialogue or any text, they tell a really emotional and a visceral story purely through the mechanics of controlling this young boy in this really simple and tried and true format of a side-scrolling platformer. Amazing game. If you haven't played it, I would highly recommend it. And it's a fantastic example of what we're talking about here, about that symbiosis of mechanical and story and gameplay and character. Or as a secondary example, maybe you want to explore, moving in 3D space, like up and down, X, Y, and Z axes, and the controls around that and how that might feel. And you think, well, that's what a UFO does. It goes up and down and sideways, and it moves around in open space. And so maybe you think, okay, well, what would do that? Let's talk about an alien race that is predicated on exploration, because that will allow us to use those mechanics as we move around the world around us. And maybe that leads to a game like Outer Wilds, where is an amazing sync between the characters that I'm inhabiting are living on the idea of exploration. They go and they scavenge things from other planets and areas around them, and they're always looking for the next thing to find and discover. And that's what the player's doing, right? They're discovering the world around them, and everything is built around this concept of using your ship to get to the next place, to understand what that place is about, and find new resources and new answers about what's around you in the world. Very different game, but also excellently executed in terms of ludonarrative harmony. So which leads to the idea of where are we going with all this? So this is where we've been and where we are right now, and some examples of games that are doing really interesting things really well. Then some other examples of games that are, trying to or holding on too much to the past of the film things. But what does this mean for the future of games? No one knows, obviously, what this is, but I have some ideas about it and some aspirations about where we might push things as we try to discover the strength of our medium. Going back to one of the precursors that I raised, which is Minecraft. Here's Steve. And you don't generally think of Steve in Minecraft as a narrative experience, right? It's a open puzzle building experience. I can do whatever I want. It's very creative. It's open completely, but that's not entirely true. The early game in Minecraft survival is very narrative and has a lot of really specific emotions that the player goes through mechanics that are powerful and deliberate. And this is a couple of streamers playing a survival Minecraft from the very beginning. And we can talk through what goes on really quickly as soon as you open up this world for the first time. The first thing that happens is you are confronted with a need. That need is survival, right? The creepy crawlies are coming at night, and if you want to live, you have to have shelter, right? So generally you just dig down and make yourself a little enclosed space where you can avoid all the monsters. But that is the number one priority for all players. It's a very visceral and human thing, right? I need shelter, I need to survive this cold, dark night. Once you've done that, and you have secured some space, then you can get into what you're seeing here, the idea of want, right? What do I want to do while I'm on this island or wherever I am? Do I want to mine down here and try and find some diamonds or something? Is that what I'm after? Or maybe I want to build like a hydroponic system that's underground that creates wheat that I can make bread with. either of those things are an option for the player, but there's an opportunity cost. I can't do one and the other at the same time. I have to just pick one and do it. And so we get into this interesting concept of wants versus needs, right? And what I can do, what I can't do. Which brings us to this really awesome, powerful triangle of, in that early game, I'm still threatened by the monsters that are outside at night. I don't have the weapons quite yet to deal with them quickly and efficiently. I also have the wants. I do have that general security of my space, and I can start figuring out how I'm going to grow it and get bigger and better. But again, I have this cost of whatever I do is going to lose me something else. And that is a really interesting human triangle that happens really quickly and is powerful, and it's very narrative. It's a really good story. But then it starts to fade out, because really quickly, fairly quickly, in a couple of hours at most, you will have all the resources you need to make the creepy crawlies no longer a threat, right? They don't matter anymore. Maybe you'll see Enderman later on in the game, but for the most part, all you can do is you can just do what you want to do all the time, and it becomes more about just executing your plan. So the story kind of loses steam and becomes more just about your desire to build stuff. But what if you take that early game of good mechanical emotions and strung together, and you put it in an environment like this, and you extrapolate it over the entire experience, right? Where it's not blocky and cartoony, and it's not this moderate threat of the creepy crawlies. It's a real survival existential thing with this kind of presentation. And I am Tom Hanks in Castaway. I am on this island. I have to use my resources and my wits to figure out how to get off it in time or not. And it's a very similar experience in its fundamental fantasy of what you're doing, but extrapolating that really strong early game of Minecraft throughout the entire experience through mechanics of Castaway is something that could be that next step, right? That ability to string together the nuance through action that we right now just do in kind of little vacuums or little chunks around the games that we've been talking about. It's just a quick idea of where it might go. Like I said, this isn't something that anybody knows, but it feels like it's moving in that direction as we get better at creating moments that are mechanically driven story beats that are tied into character. And as we understand those better, as we move our baseline gets higher, we get more adept at stringing them together as one cohesive experience. I went through that stuff pretty quickly, so I'm done now. I want to say thank you again. I don't know how many people are actually watching this, but the idea with this whole talk is to hopefully inspire people to have this discussion with themselves if they are making games on their own, and debate things that I might have said that you don't disagree with, or just explore the ideas a little deeper. And it's really exciting. And I want to end with this thought. What I talked about before about the history of film as a media, and you think about that in relationship to games now, right? Games are essentially 40 years old for intents and purposes. In terms of a media, that's very, very young. We are essentially in our adolescence. Film is 120 years old, easy. Who knows? Radio is 100 years more than that. Literature and theater since Greek and before. So you're talking about thousands of years. And what that means is all those media, the longer they're around, the baseline of what people at large understand about them gets higher and higher and higher, right? If you think about literature, for example, one of the first things you learn to do as a child in school is write a story, right? You have a character that does something. They go to the store and they get some candy, whatever that story might be. Maybe you're a darker grade 1 kid than I was. But that's something that all people understand, right? How to write a story. And that means that when you're executing story in literature, it becomes really about the nuance of it and the finer points of how well you can put together all these more elaborate concepts. And the same goes for all the other medias, right? The longer they've been around, the higher the baseline, the understanding for storytelling that people get about it. For games, we're talking about 40 years, and we're still in our adolescence. And it's historically, and I'm not being hyperbolic here, there are very few times where you get to be a part of a movement where we're discovering a new type of storytelling for humans to experience. And that's what games are in right now. That's what that precursor phase is, right? Is the discovery of that next level of storytelling. And over the history of mankind, there's really only been like 4 or 5 of those times, those inflection points. And so it's super exciting for me to be just a part of that larger group and across the world who are all trying different things. And I hope that, you know, this would inspire you to get into it too and be excited about what the future holds for all this. So I would now open this up to questions and discussion. I just want to say that I had to drop GLaDOS in there because she's one of my favorite characters of all time from games, from Portal 2, awesome, and Portal obviously, and that's my boy Alex Hunter. But yeah, so I don't know. Again, I'm not sure how many people are actually watching this right now, but I'd love to have any discussions or answer any questions that might have come out of this.
Thank you very much for sharing your experience. And it's time for Q&A. We'll start with the question. What do you think is a good way to integrate a character which is not predefined into a linear story?
How is it to integrate a character that's not predefined into a linear story?
If there is a completely free to create character like in RPG, but the story is linear.
Oh yeah. Well, that's a great question in the RPG space, and that's a different approach altogether. Generally, historically, how people have done that, right, is they provide you with a bunch of background that you can select from. So you can be an elf or you can be an orc, and that comes with certain abilities or dispositions. You know, either you're aggressive or you're exploratory or whatever it might be, and then the user gets to pick those, and then the key to that is that the world needs to respond to those selections in a way that feels satisfying, right? If I can be an elf, the world needs to react to an elf in a different way than it would react to a human or a gnome, and that's where RPGs get really costly and challenging, right? To have these expansive worlds that have the ability to make me feel like I have that decision of a fundamental character has impacted that world. Various games have had successes and failures with this. I would say Dragon's Dogma is actually an underrated one that I played, where they do a really good job of having the world respond to that character choice that I spoke about. Generally, though, mechanically speaking, they'll put it to abilities. So, you know, the old trope is I'm an elf, I'm good with a bow, right? That's Legolas from Lord of the Rings. And so that's the tried and true way of doing things. And the thing that's really challenging about that question is, like, how do you do it at scale, right? How do you in the space of, say, the Elder Scrolls, say, of Skyrim, make sure that is responding to you in everything you touch, because the amount of work that goes around getting that to happen is like exponential. It gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And I don't think anybody's quite solved that yet. There's still a lot of they put a lot in the player to infer certain things from their characters as the world is developing around them. I don't know if that answers the question exactly. I haven't worked on RPGs specifically. That's the one genre I haven't actually had a chance to work on yet. Pure RPGs, you know, Assassin's Creed has RPG elements, but it's not a pure one. But that's how I look at it. I don't know if that answers the question or if there's a follow-up to that. But
thank you for your answer. The next question is, how do you think is pushing the boundaries of storytelling in video games and indies or AAA studios, and maybe some specific examples?
Yeah, well, here's a really cool one that's recent in my credits sequence. This is, I just want to give credit to people that I referenced and talked about, but the guy in here from Hades, it's a rogue-like game. If you haven't played Hades, that just came out this year. And they do a really, again, interesting idea about the very idea of coming resurrection, right, as being the core of that game, and coming back and keeping your abilities and consciousness in that resurrection. You don't get reset to zero, but you grow through that. And the fiction of trying to escape Hades as a demigod is perfect for that fiction, right? And they do a really good job of of knitting in all this mythology, but keeping it grounded in who I am as a character and what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to escape my dad, and I have to get through literally hell to try and do that. So I think that in a smaller scale, they're doing a good job of pushing the boundaries of what Ludo narrative harmony can be. Like, what can we relate to as players and characters? Like I said before, The Last of Us 2, Naughty Dog, they have been pushing the boundaries in like a linear, more cinematic experience for a long time. You know, since since the Uncharted series, they've been at the forefront of those things. And I would say, from a pure mechanical storytelling level, and this is going to reference one of the precursors that I brought up, is Zelda Breath of the Wild. You know, Link doesn't talk; he's mute, and again, that's in perfect sync with what the player is doing. The player's not really speaking either, but the way that they design the worlds around you and give you abilities that lead to the next area, and breadcrumb you through action versus getting told via objectives or dots on the map is I think best in class, or best in the industry right now. You can explore that entire world of Hyrule in Breath of the Wild without any help, right? From menus or tutorials. You can just go out there and learn it, right? You find a plant, you study it. The game will tell you, oh, this plant is got a heat property. You go and you figure out how to mix that over the fireplace at the inn, and then suddenly you realize that, oh, now I can go to this place where there's a volcano. I can heat this plant, and it makes me more resistant to heat. And all that is just there, right? You can organically go and find that stuff. And Link as a character is wide-eyed. He's a hero. He's curious. He's an explorer. He is a bit funny, and he has a goofy side to him, and all of these things embody when I come into that world as a player, I have all those things inside me. I see this beautiful, bright space that I want to explore, and I feel all those things as a person. And so, whereas it's not typically regarded as like, you know, an elevated narrative in terms of a linear filmic story, I think as a main character, as a execution of Ludo narrative harmony, that's right at the top of the list for me.
Thank you. Next question is, how long do you think it will take for the public to perceive video games in the same way as film and books, for example?
That's a really, really interesting question, because it's accelerated just by everything around us moves faster, right? Like, we communicate faster than anybody has before. Obviously, right now I'm doing a stream, you know, across an ocean in about 4 time zones to a bunch of people I don't know, and so that's something that, you know, the ability for us to communicate as humans is so much faster, and that means people learn quicker. But I would also say probably the flip side of that is that the barriers are a bit higher, right? The barrier to entry for games as they stand right now is fairly high, especially narrative games. You know, they get attributed to consoles, and so by that very nature, there's a whole swath of people who will never play them because they don't have a console and they never will. And so we first have to break that hardware barrier. I think mobile has a little bit, but hasn't quite reached the complexity level of console or PC games. But at least everyone's got one, so it's everyone's got it in their hands. It's close, and I do think once we hit that threshold point, which is going to be the next couple of years. I mean, I've been saying it's going to be the next couple of years for the last few years, so I think we're just in that waiting stage. I think the uptake will be faster, right? So it took, you know, film after the 40s, you know, until like, you know, call it the 80s, really, that it became established as the thing. I think it'll be much quicker for games. It'll take a decade, maybe less, because it'll just move quicker. People will be more ready to pick it up. But that's a super interesting question, because that is what I was talking about before, about the baseline of knowledge from people at large, right? Understanding what game mechanics are, and so we need that touchstone. We need that first one that kind of crystallizes it for everybody. You go, oh, I get it. That's super cool that you can do that. I didn't get it before. Now I do. Now I want more. And that we already have, gamers, obviously, but we are actually a subset of a much larger population. So it's going to be a little while before we're in everybody's living room, but once we're there, I think that's going to be the moment.
All right, thank you very much for your answers and for sharing your experience. It's time to end the day, and hope to see you tomorrow. Well, not you, Matt, actually only as a viewer, but everyone else, see you tomorrow.
Awesome.